Hey everybody. This is kind of a live reaction. Well, it is a live reaction to Zora Neale Hurston claiming a space. It's a documentary done by PBS through the American Experience, and I'm somebody who, as a teacher, yes, you know, donates every month to PBS. Although I feel like their programming has gotten lackluster over the years. That actually is a nice segue into what I just watched. The documentary is about an hour and 52 minutes, so nearly 2 hours. And Saturday morning would be pretty much the only time I would have to do something like this. And I think the documentary is useful for people who don't know about Zora Neale Hurston or don't know much about her in terms of a broad scope of her life. So many of the things that they mention, like, her attending Howard University after running out of money for school in Jacksonville, and then getting a scholarship to go to Barnard and finish her degree and move on. And the kind of role she played in Harlem, in the Harlem Renaissance, in terms of the literature she produced, so on and so forth. Those kind of things, the overarching themes of her life were good. Um, what I find problematic, and often find problematic when people do these documentaries on Black women, especially once they are no longer alive to speak for themselves, is one, the lack of other African American scholars and African Americans who have studied her work specifically, who have taught her work. And then they find one or two Black people, and then they find all these white people who have studied her life and are all of a sudden experts on it. And one of the themes that come up and came up in her writing and in real life was the way in which her work was deemed in many ways by other Black people, sometimes as sort of this minstrelsy or fodder for white laughter. Because the one thing she did that was very pioneering was that she recorded Black people and wrote on Black folklore, Black anthropology, despite the racism in anthropologist, and that whole discipline of study around what do Black people's culture have to do with anything, right? But she's documenting these things. But she does it by going back to the South where she was from, in Florida, and across the South, places like Alabama, so on and so forth. And she records it in a Southern dialect. And what made to some people seem like, well, yeah, white people laugh at it. Well, white people laugh at a lot of things that we do. White people mock a lot of things that we do. And then before you know it, I mean, literally, they're copying it and imitating it. I mean, it took them a week to Columbus the word woke. Okay, that's why I don't really use it like that, because white people just snatched it and and just misappropriated it as they always do. Anyway, so we have this with Zora Neale Hurston, and they're talking about, how she kept the Black vernacular in her work. One, I do think that was incredibly bold and brave, and still not something that people are willing to do, because there is a sense of shame, and because white people are part of the larger society that controls and gatekeep what is considered good literature versus bad literature. Um, but what she did was she preserved the integrity of the history of African Americans by saying, this is what they told me, this is how they told me. And yes, I recorded Barracoon, which was the last surviving formerly enslaved person who had come over on a ship. Um, Actually, in the midst of the Civil War. So, anybody tell you slave trading stopped at the beginning of the 19th century? Lies. People just continued to do it illegally, smuggling Africans, whole human beings, not in mass, because America focused on breeding. We'll get there at some point. That's another lecture for another day. But what she refused to do was translate his words in what maybe other people consider broken English, but African American vernacular over time, and what it means to have to learn a whole different language and having the trauma of being owned as someone's property. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that for you. I'm not going to do that for white publishers. I'm not going to do that for anybody. These are his words. I had to get other Black people to learn to even trust me so I could record this. The least I could do is keep the integrity of such. If you can't read it, the same way Black people have to learn how to read white American English is the same way you need to learn how to read this if you are truly interested. And that, my friends, is what we call deep integrity and a commitment that should always be there to our race, to our people. And I know most people, many people will not be, but as long as I have a voice, I'm going to make sure I say this, especially for African American women who put themselves out there, a woman who very boldly lived her life, was not focused on getting married and didn't have children, and kept living, kept working for something, striving for something greater and good. And the way in which people shamed her for that, even in this documentary, kind of act like, oh, well, she didn't have this, she didn't have, like, she didn't want it, she didn't pursue that. And guess what? Black women, that's okay. It's okay to want it, it's okay to not want it. There are too many people always trying to tell us how to feel. Okay, so even as I watched it, a lot of the stuff they said, they were like, well, she would try to get fellowships to support her research because, I mean, at this time and now, like, people still get the MacArthur fellowships to further their work, or the Guggenheim fellowships to further their work, or the Schomburg to support their work. You need larger resources. And it was, oh, she doesn't have a PhD. Well, most people didn't have a PhD. Most people still don't have a PhD. Okay. Um, or it was because she was undisciplined. That was the word they were using. I was like, oh my God, this white man is sitting up here. Well, she was undisciplined in many ways. She didn't really like the structure. The structure, yes, that white Anglo-Saxons had provided centuries before and white Americans took on and then said, you are to learn our way of doing it. And when you don't, it therefore is not credible. So what I need you to do, and PBS, who rolled that camera and let that footage stay in this documentary without appropriate critique, and by appropriate critique, I mean having another anthropologist, another scholar who would critique what he had to say in a different setting, like in a different interview right after that, so we understand what's happening with him and what the real deal is, that's necessary. And I'm tired of people, getting so happy to be on TV, black people, black women, being so happy to be on TV that they're too afraid or they tiptoe around things that would give language that would protect Zora Neale Hurston and her legacy. Okay? So the reason why I did those reviews on Kindred is because I admire Octavia Butler and her pioneering work in black science fiction, the godmother of Afrofuturism, and one of the greatest science fiction writer, as far as I'm concerned, that ever lived, was because I don't appreciate people taking black women's legacies and playing with that. In the words of another black woman I heard, black women have been writing for over a century. Literally, all we have to do is read it. A lot of the answers are there. And true to form in this documentary, you have black men like Richard Wright, who I consider one of the greatest writers of all time. I think Black Boy is a much better book than Native Son. Nevertheless, Richard Wright, Alain Locke, who is considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance, all these people came out against her greatest work. Their eyes were watching God. They dismissed it as a romance novel. They dismissed it as the sort of minstrel talking that white people laugh at. And once again, this kind of piling on of black men publicly against a black woman and the way she writes. They knew that. They knew how to contact her if they want to talk to her about her writing. But see, the opposite isn't expected, or the opposite isn't given. When black women go out of their way to make sure, hey, this is, I'm letting you know this, that, and the other. And I'm not talking about the Candace Owens's of the world. Okay, I'm not talking about them. And this is important because this seems to be a recurring thing. This is a recurring theme in our history. And I don't want it to be something that continues. So it's important that we call this out, one, so people can learn from it and do better, not simply know it and then use it as a talking point when they get in these anti-racist POC circles and then never put it into practice. And the next thing you know, black people, white people included, okay, are downing the next black person for being smart enough to say, hey, this is racist, this is what it is. Well, I think they went too hard, this and the other. And and you're chatting with these white people so you can move up because having a position is more important than integrity. And quite frankly, that ain't gonna get you into heaven. Now, you can say people have different religious views. They probably do, but a lot of them go to church and don't care. They go to church for a networking opportunity. Why am I doing that? Because I'm trying to make a point. Anyway, so Zora Neale Hurston always holds a special place in my heart. My mother introduced me to her work. Their Eyes Were Watching God. Um, and my mother, who is a extraordinary woman, um, who did not was not able to complete college, community college, despite always wanting to go back, and eventually put herself through community college with an EKG course. Like, my mother is one of those people who just kept going. But I am the third of five children. We're all 2 years apart, and all five of us graduated from college. Four of the five of us graduated from HBCUs. Um, and my mother sacrificed so much of her life. Four out of five of us have advanced degrees. Um, so I say this to say that when you say things like, oh, Zora Neale Hurston wasn't within the discipline, she wasn't disciplined enough for this, that, and the other. And my mother is the very person who introduced me to her because she felt a connection with her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and read it over and over again and introduced me to that as a Black woman and the way in which I, as a Black Southerner, completely enjoyed the book. And then, you go and read Amazon reviews. Well, this should have been in clearer English. Like the same thing from like 80, 90 years ago. So it's just so mind blowing to me. But I think, once again, my particular closeness with Zora Neale Hurston comes from the fact that, yeah, you may not be in the framework that everybody else wants you to be. Hell, my mother is not or was not in the framework that everybody else wants her to be. My mother's smarter than any 20 people in any goddamn room any given motherfucking time, including me. And I can never let nobody take that away from her. Period. Okay? And so when I see Black women's legacies like this, and they do have a Black woman that comes on at the end who's saying all the right stuff. I love how y'all gave her the last 20 minutes of a 2-hour documentary that, considering if you made it that far, you know what I mean? Like, I resent that because I know it's purposeful. And people go, oh, they don't mean to. No, it's not unintentional. It's not. It's not. That's why this game of racism has been so strong for so many centuries. You think it's unintentional? Stop playing with me. And so when I have a chance to say something, I want to do it. I don't care if only 3 people watch this video. Hey, just like Zora Neale Hurston wrote books that people didn't understand, there comes a time when things outlive you. Just like I tell my students, what you write will always outlive you. And there's a whole lot of things that now people can go back and critique about white ideas of Black people's intellect, why slavery was justifiable. I mean, there's people now that just believe that anyway. But there is a place for this stuff. And just because the people of that time don't accept it doesn't mean it's not worthy of what you think it's worthy of. And people always go, I heard Paul Mooney say this, you say somebody's ahead of their time. No, I'm in my time. Just because you in my time don't want to hear it, that's unfortunate. And writing down and documenting these things, despite what people tell you, is important. So don't let degree or no degree, position or lack of position stop you from doing what you think is important. And once Zora Neale Hurston had film, she began to document, services that Black people had, and these things, not for a show, but so people can know about this rich cultural tradition. And we can say, well, those sort of things should stay private. Well, considering the nature of social media, there's a lot of things that should stay private. But we wouldn't have it if she wouldn't have done that. The same way that Malcolm X, regardless of the controversial decision it was, even within the Nation of Islam, when he said, no, bring the cameras in here. And that documentary is called The Hate Produced. And it shows the Nation of Islam on another level. And while white people are so busy, narrating this, talking about demonizing it, there's Black people across the country, because at that time, in the late 50s, you only had one channel, like 1 or 2 channels or whatever. And all these Black people who never knew this organization existed now do. Malcolm X didn't have to tell them everything he was doing. He knew their reasoning wasn't his, but he used it, just like Zora Neale Hurston when they talk about her white benefactor. Mary, I forget her name. I want to say Ovington, but that's another person. This white lady who helped fund a lot of her publishing. And Zora Neale Hurston, in her private writings, which are not mentioned in here, she talks about how she knew it was racist, how she would kind of laugh and joke and wink with other younger Black Harlem Renaissance writers, right? When white people would, say racist things, and she'd be like, "What's the point? I'm not gonna argue back with her. Let her use her money to publish this. I know what I'm doing." And then there are younger Black Harlem Renaissance writers who rightfully critique her in private conversation. She tells them, "Hey, I'm using this so I can preserve this." And they're like, "I'm not going to degrade myself." And, she doesn't shame them. I mean, they have a difference of opinion. She doesn't shame them, but she still serves as a teacher to many of them. And that's what we have to learn to do, not break off from each other simply because we have differing views. Don't get me wrong, sometimes you gotta do that. But I'm just saying, just generally, especially when it's on an intellectual level, things that could be consequential. I mean, some of my greatest lessons have come from some of my largest disagreements. Even if I don't walk away, I mean, when you walk away, you're still in your emotions. But even like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, months later, years later, you think back on some of those conversations, even if you still stand where you stand in an argument, you have a better understanding of why that person thinks what they think, which helps you interact with other people who don't think like you. And Zora Neale Hurston also, when she quit playing the role that many Black Harlem Renaissance writers played, some for a shorter period of time, like Langston Hughes just couldn't take it. When they realized white people, this is still their form of that Southern slave like control, despite their sort of white liberal approach to funding Black things. They wanted Black fiction, they wanted ideas that helped promote what they thought about Black people. And when they started trying to control their work, they resented it and they walked away from it. Now, did they lose money? Absolutely. It's costly. It's costly to take a stand when you're Black, then and now. Um, and those kind of things are thought provoking. So I say, yeah, it's useful for people who don't know that much about Zora Neale Hurston. It's useful for people like me so I can know what is continuing to be placed out there about the history of African Americans that I disapprove of. Just so I know, hell, what not to suggest to people. So anyway, I think it's worth a watch and worth a critique. I don't know, once again, like I said, even if only 3 people watch this, oh well. But please be sure to like and subscribe as I try to grow my channel if you are interested. And the documentary, again, is called Zora Neale Hurston, Claiming a Space. And I will talk to you all soon. Have a good day.